Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. Today is Poetry Thursday. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different with this episode of Poetry Thursday, where normally I will focus on the poetry of one particular poet, or I will focus on a particular theme in poetry. Today I wanted to just talk about some of the resources and references that I have in my collection, because people frequently ask me where to begin with poetry. I've had many requests in my comments, for me to talk about how do you get started in poetry. People have written, I want to read poetry, I want to understand poetry, I don't know, I feel like I don't understand it, or I just don't know where to begin. And so I just kind of went through my poetry collection and I pulled a couple of books that I have found very helpful as I put these videos together, and they were very helpful to me when I was a teacher for almost 40 years, teaching poetry among other things as well. So the first book that I wanted to mention is a book that's readily available secondhand. And this is a very old text, Laurence Perrine's Sound and Sense, An Introduction to Poetry. This text is commonly used in AP English literature courses on the high school level and in college literature classes, in poetry. There have been many editions of this book over the years. Mine is the 7th edition, but I don't even know what edition it's in now. The newer editions of it can be very costly, but there are used editions of it all over the internet for very reasonable prices. This book contains almost 300 poems in it, 300 poems written in English, but it also contains a discussion of the language of poetry, the elements of poetry. What makes poetry different from prose? What are the devices that we look at when we're looking at poetry? And it's a very accessible text for just becoming well versed in the language of poetry. And as I said, there are almost 300 poems, British and American poems, in this volume. Two other resources that I frequently recommend to people are poetry guidebooks that were written by my beloved Mary Oliver. There is, the first one she wrote is A Poetry Handbook, a prose guide to understanding and writing poetry. And then a little bit later, a few years later, she wrote Rules for the Dance, a handbook for writing and reading metrical verse. Both of these books are anthologies that include a great deal of poetry to just sort of read around in, to decide, what you like. But they also give us a discussion to lend to our understanding of how poems are made. Two really accessible, beautiful volumes, even more accessible than the Perrine. And these are also frequently used in literature classes. And it's Mary Oliver. Okay. Two other books that I wanted to talk about are books that I have mentioned on the channel in the past. Someone I've been following for some time now. This is an Irish poet, Padraig Tuama, and I first discovered him on the NPR show of Krista Tippett's On Being. And he does a series where he discusses poetry. And the first volume that he published from that series is called Poetry Unbound, 50 Poems to Open Your World. And then he came out with a second volume just this past year, 44 poems on being with each other, a Poetry Unbound collection. Now, what Tuama does in both of these volumes is that he gives us a poem. Many of them are very famous, very recognizable poems. So he gives us a poem, and then he gives a brief discussion of that poem. He sort of does his own analysis and interpretation of that poem. If you listen to him on the podcast, he reads the poem, then he does his discussion of the poem, and then he reads the poem again. I've recommended both of these volumes to many, many people because they're a great way to sort of see a diversity of poetry, to see what you might be interested in, and you also get a brief, very accessible analysis of the poem. I mean, sometimes people aren't looking for that, but if you do feel like you're reading poetry and you don't really, you know that you like how something sounds, but you don't necessarily know that you or feel like you're understanding it, these books are really great for that because they don't overwhelm you with analysis, but they do give us very, very sort of thoughtful ideas to think about as we encounter these poems. The first one, 50 Poems to Open Your World, that's now available in paperback. The second one's not in paperback yet. It will be soon, I'm sure. I don't think it's in paperback yet. Another one that I've never seen anybody talk about on BookTube is a book that I have simply adored, and this is Kim Rosen's Saved by a Poem. This is a discussion of 10 very well-known poems. So we get the text of the poem, and then we get a discussion of that poem. And then at the end of the book, Rosen also gives us something like 50 more poems to consider. Something like that. It's a large number. There's a large number of poems included in here. Further, 50 poems, 50 more poems to live by heart. Now, she actually recommends, memorizing poems and really committing them to heart, but that's not necessary to appreciate this book. But what she's really doing here is kind of inviting us to experience a poetic text almost as one might experience a sacred text, to really sort of live with the language of the poem for some time. Now, mine is an old edition. Mine actually came with a CD where you could hear the poems being read as well. I think that current editions of the book don't come with that, but I think there are ways to access the audio part of this book online now. Then I just thought I would talk about a few anthologies that I have found very helpful in terms of just exposure to a lot of different poets and different kinds of poetry. As you probably know, if you've been watching my Poetry Thursday episodes, when I present a poet, I often do so through a number of individual texts that I have acquired of that particular poet's work. But, if you're getting started in reading poetry and you don't really know who you like or who you want to read, you're not going to go out and buy a bunch of individual poetry texts when you don't know yet if that's a poet that you really want to, experience in a deep way and, kind of live with. So anthologies can be great for reading around and determining first of all, reading a lot of poetry and then determining, who you really like and who you want to explore in more depth. One anthology that I recommend is the Norton anthology of poetry. This one, and this is actually the shorter edition. This is the shorter edition at, almost 1,400 pages. This includes over 1,000 years of poetry in English. So almost everybody's in here, at least a sampling of their work. Another anthology that has come out relatively recently. This is Ada Limon's anthology. She is the poet laureate. She's the 24th poet laureate of the United States, and she put together a collection about a year ago. I think it was a year ago. Let me just verify that. Yes, it was in 24. Poetry in the Natural World. And this is a collection of poetry, nature poetry and poetry about people just encountering parts of the natural world. And this was one of her, projects as poet laureate. And she includes in here all kinds of contemporary poets. I don't know how many poems are in here. Quite a few, and these are contemporary people writing, right now. Some books that I've also talked about on a couple of occasions are two books that my other beloved poet, Billy Collins, put out, which were these were books that he edited when he was the poet laureate, and these are Poetry 180, A Turning Back to Poetry, and 180 More, Extraordinary Poems for Every Day. Now, both of these were part of his project as the poet laureate, where it was his goal to get poetry in the schools, and he was trying to get teachers and principals, to commit to reading a poem a day and sharing a poem a day with students. And so, he put out 180, Poetry 180, and then followed it up with 180 more. And these are basically collections of contemporary poetry and just poetry that students might find accessible. They're just beautiful volumes, and especially if you kind of want to read poetry but don't know what to read, because you don't know who you like yet, those would be really good volumes that I could recommend. And then another one is Garrison Keillor's. This is edited by Garrison Keillor. Good Poems, American Places. Now there are many contemporary poems in here, but there are also some older American poems as well. There are poems certainly going back to the 19th century. I don't know if he has anything in here from the 18th century, but and then a lot of contemporary poems too. But basically what he's doing here is kind of celebrating the geography and the culture of America that bind us together. And he's doing this through the idea of place, looking at poetry that deals with the land or particular places. And it's just a great collection. And again, it's almost 500 pages of American poetry in that instance. And another American poetry volume that I have is the Vintage Book of Contemporary American Poetry. Now, this is an older edition. It's probably been revised by now, but this includes poets throughout American history up to and through the 1990s. So there probably is a later version of this as well. So I just thought that that might be helpful to people who have just been asking me through the last 15 months or so, as I've been doing Poetry Thursday, if I could just sort of talk about how to get started. So anyway, that will be it for today. I'll be back again next week for next week's Poetry Thursday, with my regularly scheduled programming. So as always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.